I must have been, I'll say 12 years old, and my parents had a record of his organ music, and it included sort of the end of Satyagraha and a bunch of the dances, and it was just completely mesmerizing. And I remember really specifically it was this really 80s cover in a really cheesy font with like all this air coming out of the pipes, and it looked like sort of Fantasia meets Tron or something, which is kind of how it sounds too, and I just remember being completely mesmerized. I met Philip actually in a real rush. I started working for him when I was 18, and I had just moved to New York, and his copyist wasn't able to finish something on time, and someone called someone through a friend of a friend of a friend who basically they needed someone who could copy out a score really quick, and they called me, and I sort of turned up, and Philip was like, right, okay, good to meet you, young man. Here's this huge pile of manuscript paper. Basically, my work with Philip was I was an editor and a MIDI sequencer for his film scores for about 8 years. So that meant that he would hand me piles of manuscript, and I would turn it into audio magically by playing in all the parts. So I became incredibly intimate with not only his process, but what it takes to it's sort of like conducting in slow motion. You have to sort of make all these little decisions about the patterns and about when things line up, and all the while making it fit with picture. It was great, and he's someone who has a real calm but urgent approach to writing basically all of his music, which I really admire. There's never any ego about it. It's always very very sort of simple and humble and straightforward. Philip's someone who I think he wrote an enormous amount of vocal music that in the 60s and 70s up into the 80s that I would say you wouldn't necessarily define as operatic. It was this kind of non-vibrato or very, very sort of highly stylized. The words tended to be, if not abstract, then made of sort of the alphabet or numbers or sulfur syllables, and that to me was always very exciting. And then Philip has of late sort of developed a secondary way of thinking about vocal writing that's much more operatic, which strangely I found less. It doesn't bubble up in my work as much as the older stuff, where you have these moments where people just sort of break down into the elemental sort of ABCs of singing. Which his work in sort of Einstein on the Beach, the way that the vocal writing in that works is incredibly exciting to me. But I love that he's sort of taken that and over the course of his 40, 50-year career, changed it now into these very lyrical, very operatic, sort of melismatic writing. It's cool to see. One of the strange things about being a young composer is that the idea that you would ever write an opera seems so incredibly distant. It seems like when I'm real old, I'll maybe have the sort of presence of mind to do that. But one thing that I learned a lot from Philip was that the act of writing an opera requires a bunch of really hard thinking and a lot of preparation and a lot of things that you basically do know how to do as a young person, or are learning how to do as a young person. And once you have the right libretto, and once you have the right sort of situation, the opera writes itself. The music comes very quickly, which I found to be actually true now that I'm sort of writing 2 operas. I find that if you think hard enough about it, and if you make sure that your chops are in good condition, which you get by writing cello music or vocal, song cycles or a random piece for piano and vibraphone, anything sort of helps you build the muscle that it requires to then just sort of effortlessly write opera, which is I think sort of one of the most complicated things to do. So Philip I think has, in just the sheer number of operas that he's written and in how different they are. I mean, so if you look at something like Einstein or Satyagraha versus Appomattox, he's come, I don't like to say a long way because it implies a sort of linearity, but he's gone many degrees around the circle over the last couple of years. And I think it's very liberating. Mm-hmm. It feels like you don't have to write in a certain way. You don't have to make everything feel like 19th century Italian opera or like Wagner or like something that has to be heavily amplified and on a grid with weird abstract motion. I mean, you can sort of do it all. I don't think there is, but what I like about it is that it's taken such strange turns. I mean, I think if you listen, for me, I remember when I heard it's like his 8th symphony or something, or I think it's the 8th one. It's the second movement of this thing is the weirdest, most like bizarre upside down Shostakovich land kind of trippy trumpet solo thing, and I like that it's so different from what he was doing in the '60s, and I feel like if he lives another 40 years, which he probably will, that he'll go somewhere also unexpected, and I think there's something really really thrilling to see someone build a career on a lot of similarity, but also on a lot of big seismic differences. Satyagraha is something that is, first of all, one of my favorite pieces of music, but I think it's so it's so good at inspiring production teams to make something beautiful out of it, and I think that's really the mark of a great opera composer, is if you can write music that gets the set designer, that gets the puppet designer, if there's that gets all these people to really think about what they're doing and deliver something at the top of their craft. And I think the last sort of 12 minutes of Satyagraha and this new production that happened at the ENO and at the Met was one of the most beautiful things I've ever seen in my life. And I was at the Met, and I've never been in an opera where this happened, and there was there's this sort of moment where it's all been in these threes, these patterns of threes, and it opens up into these fours, and a flute comes in and doubled by an organ, and this projection happens in the back, and everything is happening, and everyone around me just completely started weeping. Like little children at the Met. It was so like women were like wiping their eyes with their furs. I mean, it was so fabulous, and I saw it again at the ENO, and the same thing happened. Everyone was just completely like little children. I mean, it was so great, and I think the fact that a work from however many years ago, I mean, from before I'm born, can still have this visceral impact that works just with the music and with the set and with the light and the aerials, and everything was just happening, and I think that you don't know what's happening to you, but as an audience member, it really really works, and I think that's something really amazing and great. Philip is one of the easiest people to work with ever. He basically has no enormous sort of ego attachment to his music, and I think he's someone who's very happy to, in a collaborative situation, revise, make it work, figure out what the best thing is for the situation at hand, and it's less to do with his vision than the vision that the piece requires, if that makes sense. He's really very willing to sort of float in the world of the piece rather than impose what's a pretty strict, not necessarily not strict, but what can be a very specific vision onto a story. I think he's very flexible. I also found that his approach to the act of writing, which is it's his job, you get up and you do it, it was really refreshing, because before I met him, a lot of the composers I met were very, I don't want to say unprofessional, but were sort of like, shamanistic about their writing processes. It was about, you go into the woods and you drink a lot and you go a little crazy and you kind of have to leave reality and whatever, and it's, whereas Philip is like, whatever, I'm on 3rd Street with my family doing this, getting up, feeding the kids, walking, it's a very quotidian process, and that for me was also a sort of a liberating realization that you don't have to be, out in the woods in a loincloth, like communing with the trees or whatever. It's a sort of, it's a serious business that requires getting up on time and treating yourself correctly. Well, Philip's music, I think, if I were trying to find a through line from the really early things to the later pieces, he's someone who is rhythmically incredibly precise, and the music is always illuminated from within by a kind of constant metronomic ticking. And what is illuminated ends up being these sort of fabulous colors. I think he's someone who's almost a very French colorist. Even the very rigid early music has this sort of lusciousness to it. And then things that he's written more recently, he still gets into these obsessions with combinations of instruments. So, for instance, in Waiting for the Barbarians, which is this opera from maybe 6 or 7 years ago, there's this contrabass clarinet constantly kind of undulating around, and you get into these patterns with it. So it's something about pattern and color and texture. I mean, it's hard to put your finger on it, which I think is good. I think the minute you can put your finger on it, it becomes less interesting. But there's something about this constant heartbeat illuminating all these different colors, usually in the service of drama and sometimes in the service of an abstract kind of beauty. That's how I would define it. I mean, I think there's always been a strange overlap between the worlds of writing film music and writing operatic music, and I think Philip's work in film comes from an operatic tradition. And I remember I'm trying to think of a really specific example. But we were talking. He did the score for Notes on a Scandal, and he was saying, okay, well, what we need to do is we have to say the English horn belongs to this character and the flute belongs to this character. And I thought, well, what a great idea! And of course it comes, and he was like, oh, it comes from the Turn of the Screw, where that little boy always has that English horn, and that you think, right, exactly. There's this idea that even if you're not going to work motivically, if there's not going to be themes for people, which is a way that you can write film music, but Philip doesn't do that. But there's this sense of people bringing their own bag, and there's always a sort of that characters are accessorized in a specific way, and I think his approach to film scoring is in that way kind of old-fashioned and great, but also putting his music under a film lifts it in a way that I think there's a lot of internal energy to the music, and it really kind of brings the story up. It was always exciting to watch that happen. And at first, it was the first couple of things I did. It was really magic, and then as I got into it, I thought, wow, it really does always work. It's you just sort of put it there, and then it happens. But it's good. It's sort of like butter at the end of a sauce or something. Like you can never go wrong with it. He's still alive, so it's a little morbid. I mean, I'd like to think that his sort of really great early works from the 16s and 70s will be considered kind of some among the great American / any operas of the last century. I don't know. It's hard to figure that out, because I feel like we'll all be surprised by what survives the Mayan apocalypse or whatever. Do you know what I mean? It's like after 2012, who knows? We're all going to be clinging on to our sort of Carole King records or something in the fallout shelter, and maybe we'll have a copy of Satyagraha too. I don't know. We should be so lucky. I mean, certainly he's someone who knows how to control an emotional situation calmly without being hysterical. I think his score for The Hours is a really perfect example of that, where it sets a mood for this very complicated story without insisting on anything, and it's just the right amount of melodramatic without being over the top. I remember we went to a lot of screenings that were very sort of teary, and his music at the end, when sort of Virginia Woolf is writing that letter to her husband, we really could have gone out of control with that. And his is just a series of parallel emotions, all in the white notes. It's this incredibly delicate, simple thing, and everyone's all weeping and great, and it's exciting. But then also you can go to a concert of something like Music in 12 Parts, which is this sort of totalist thing that's 6 hours long and has a really controlled structure, and it's sort of a meditative practice where you're in this incredibly aware headspace, but also find yourself very relaxed and also very energized. I went to a concert of that at Lincoln Center Festival a couple of summers ago, and I remember watching people really having a physical reaction to it in that way that you could with sort of Morton Feldman or doing drugs or whatever. There's this really the body sort of immediately reacts, and that's good. I mean, I feel like for composers you want to engage with people on that level, that sort of fist to the gut, as opposed to, oh, that was interesting. It's good to have that sort of visceral thing.